More than 10% of Americans over the age of 12 use antidepressants. Antidepressants are among the most frequently used medications in the United States. Newly released study shows how antidepressants help bacteria resist antibiotics. Global survey shows that in 2019, antimicrobial resistance killed more people than HIV/AIDS or malaria. The fentanyl drug crisis is on the rise in the United States. Fentanyl is a cause of overdose, while the country's drug epidemic killed close to 110,000 people in 2021. It seems the drugs that are meant to cure people are making the population sicker. Sick on drugs. The United States Center for Disease Control and Prevention announced that, at the end of May 2022, close to 40% of American adults had experienced symptoms of depression and anxiety during the past month, a quarter of which received antidepressants or other psychiatric drugs. The New York Times also reported that between 2017 and 2021, American teenagers' use of antidepressants rose by 41%. Most adults that feel depressed do not take antidepressants, but the total number of the ones that do are still staggering. More than 10% of Americans aged 12 and above take antidepressants in the United States. This is while in 1990, less than 3% of adults had taken these drugs.
I think in this country, certainly stigma has really changed in the last 20 years, and certainly with our younger population, they're talking about anxiety and depression a lot, whereas people, in my generation and older didn't talk about it so much.
Being unable to connect with large groups of people in the way that, humans are used to. It was really hard just to wake up, Being asleep was my favorite thing about the day because I didn't have to be awake and be thinking and wanting to be with people but not being able to.
The rise of the use of antidepressants is while Nature magazine recently published a study stating that antidepressants are causing drug resistance and resistance towards antibiotics in particular. Chin-Hua Guo, the author of this study, working at the Australian Centre for Water and Environmental Biotechnology at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, became interested in the possible contribution of non-antibiotic drugs to antibiotic resistance in 2014. Why is it that so many Americans take antidepressants?
I think the first thing to look at is that these figures parallel the decline in the rise, if you like, of inequality in wealth inequality in America, and also the decline in living standards of many Americans, specifically lower income Americans who have really not seen their wages and their work compensation increase substantially for over 30 years. It's only just in this very last period from COVID that there's been any increase at all, but that's still less than inflation. That's the major cause.
Chin-Hua Guo reported that even though antidepressants are a completely different class of drugs, they are driving bacteria to develop resistance against antibiotics. He adds that even after a few days of exposure, bacteria develop drug resistance not only against one, but multiple antibiotics. This would mean that antidepressants may help the rise of superbugs in the environment or the human body.
Without changing people's habits and developing new drugs quickly, drug resistance is going to pose a huge threat to human health, and it's going to do so in our lifetime.
The findings of this new study is extremely important and alarming. antibiotic resistance is a significant public health threat throughout the world. It is estimated that 1.2 million people have died as a direct result of antibiotic resistance in 2019, and the number is only expected to climb. In fact, global survey shows that antimicrobial resistance took the lives of more people in that year than HIV/AIDS or malaria did. What does the findings of this recent study mean for the United States?
When it comes to precise interaction of drugs, antidepressants or antibiotics, and other kinds of treatment drugs for infections and so forth, the issue, these precise mechanisms that can take place really have to be studied by expert biochemical, medical chemical researchers. And there are interactions. But secondly, you have a lot of co-conditions among Americans concerning their health if they are taking antidepressants or antibiotics. You have a very high rate of obesity. People are fat. They are depressed. That strains the organs in the body. It creates a disposition for more illness of all kinds, respiratory, problems in the gastro and other systems. So there is not automatically a simple relationship of antibiotics and antidepressants, but you've created the conditions for very bad interactions.
Interestingly, with the harmful effects of antidepressants on the environment and humans now coming to light, another study has shown that antidepressants and psychiatric medications over time may not be doing anything in improving the overall quality of life of the patient. In a study on millions of Americans, after 2 years, those taking antidepressants reported feeling no better regarding either physical or mental quality of life issues than those not taking the drugs.
For decades, we thought that the primary pathology, the primary cause of depression, was some abnormality in these neurotransmitters, specifically serotonin or norepinephrine.
However, norepinephrine and serotonin did not seem to be able to account for the symptoms of depression in people who had major depression. Instead, the chemical messengers between the nerve cells in the higher centers of the brain involved in regulating mood and emotion, which include glutamate and GABA, were possibilities as alternative causes for the symptoms of depression.
Dr. David Katz, the founding director of the Prevention Research Center at Yale University and president of the Preventive Medicine Advocacy Organization, said that he was not surprised by the study findings, adding that antidepressant drugs tend to be only nominally effective even in the short term. He also added that much of the impact of the drugs is because of their placebo effect.
I think, the overuse of antibiotics has antidepressants, and that has been documented for a very long time. And we all know that it reduces people's immunity. That's the very first thing. It also goes into, through animals, through the food supply chain, and then enters back into human bodies in that way. And of course, then what happens is people who are eating this kind of low quality food are then also, taking drugs, antidepressants, and other kinds of opioids, for example, that is causing them to get other diseases. And for example, there's a study just released not very long ago, a couple of weeks ago, about the extraordinary rise of syphilis in, I think it was Mississippi, one of the states in America. An extraordinary rise in syphilis. And a lot of this has got to do with that antibiotics, and also to do with the fact that hospitals are still very, very overcrowded in America, and access to getting testing and prenatal care and things like that are quite difficult for many Americans. Only 16 Americans are fully covered by Medicare or Medicare aid. And that leaves a very, very large proportion of people in America without a health or safety net.
In the 70s, the American Psychiatric Association, APA, fearing to lose its legitimacy, sought to brand psychiatrists as medical doctors who are treating patients with diseases. This rebranding also called for a different definition for depression, so that depression would be known as a disease that would require medication for treatment. Not surprisingly, pharmaceutical companies jumped aboard, campaigning in support of so-called depression awareness so as to make the billions of dollars they are making today off psychiatric drugs.
What's called Big Pharma, the very large famous pharmaceutical chemical medicine-producing houses like Merck, AstraZeneca, many other kinds of AstraZeneca, many other kinds of companies. They have been allowed through deregulation for 30 or 40 years to just play the market and produce mood drugs for antidepressants and other things, and not have the support and direction and ordering by the national government of what kind of research and what kind of manufacturing of medications would be in the public interest. Because instead of making profits, which is all right, it's fair enough, by producing reliable and good drugs, the companies have switched to producing opiates of all kinds, and even raising certain kinds of medicines and mood drugs in abroad from the United States. And this should they should be ordered, induced, and pressured to produce the vaccines and the medications, both for the U.S. and wherever needed internationally. This is a matter of the public welfare.
There are little evidence to prove that antidepressants are actually helping psychiatric patients, while there are many that show that they are in reality harming them. 6 out of 7 psychiatric patients report that they experience drug side effects without any benefit. The most common side effect may be sexual dysfunction, which at times lasts long after the patients stop taking the drugs. This side effect can cause problems that might make the patient feel depressed as a result. What is being done to limit the use of antidepressants and antibiotics that cause drug resistance?
You know, the decent health experts and doctors and medical specialists do recommend do not misuse and widely use antibiotics. It's better to have your farm animals as well as your population be in the best circumstances to be able to naturally resist microbes, viruses, and bacteria. And the best way to ensure that is for high technology family scale farms. So the farmer can make the decision, does an animal need an antibiotic, but only get it under certain circumstances.
Millions of Americans suffering with psychiatric problems and depression turn to antidepressants or other drugs to try and relieve their suffering. The COVID-19 pandemic and its effect on the economy and living elevated depression and drug use. Many Americans coping with psychological disorders or pain turn to other drugs in hope of finding relief. One such drug is the dangerous fentanyl drug, which can be purchased by prescription or illegally in the black market.
Well, the existent problem is already very large, and there's very many deaths. And what we've seen is that the United States government has made efforts to blame everybody else. They've said that Mexico is, the source and the causing the drug problem. They've said that all of these drugs are coming from China, and China should do more about these drug problems. That opium and other drugs came from Afghanistan, and they should do more about that. So this, of course, is obfuscation. I mean, this is not the real cause. The real cause is demand, and that demand is being caused because people do not have the education, do not have the health standards that are required and needed, that Big Pharma is making profits at the expense of the health of the nation, even though they, obviously say they're helping by the development of their drugs, but actually they're profit making, and they don't really think about this, and there's very few controls on them. And mental health, of course, also is on the rise in the United States. And look, all of this equates to the way that the United States is being run. It subjugates its trade policy and its domestic policies to foreign policy. It spends enormous amounts of money that it has to borrow because of the power of the dollar to fund all of this. And it's that in itself is decreasing the purchasing power of the dollar and undermining the salaries and wages and services, health, education, infrastructure in the country. And I think, that's going to continue. And wealth inequality in America is the highest anywhere. And I don't see any end to this problem. I don't think that the government is making any true effort to realize an end to this problem. They're just passing the buck and blaming everybody else.
Fentanyl is a strong opioid drug that is often prescribed when other sedative or pain relief medication is not enough to relieve the patient's pain. Fentanyl, however, is found to be addictive, and not only that, some experts believe that the drug itself makes it extremely difficult to start addiction treatment. Fentanyl is a main cause of drug overdose, which has taken the lives of nearly 108,000 Americans in 2021.
There is a plague of drug use in the United States, and in fact, it's so bad that the leading cause of death of Americans between the ages of 18 years old and 45 years old is drugs, directly through overdose or otherwise through indirect debilitation and sickening of their bodies. So the widespread prescription or black market use of synthetic opioids like fentanyl and others has reached extreme proportions. And in addition, sometimes there are other things that contribute to the likelihood of death connected to it. There's a substance that's used in veterinary for animals as a tranquilizer, and that's added into fentanyl. And it's been very bad in Philadelphia and New Jersey. So there are many stories about this, but overall, this is an epidemic of drug use resulting in the actual increased death rate in the United States.
The drug epidemic is alarming in the United States. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration's 2021 National Survey on Drug Use and Health discovered that 16.5% of the American population, which makes close to 47 million people aged 12 and above, had a substance use disorder in the past year. 24 million individuals were classified as having a drug use disorder. How does prescribing fentanyl and its addiction side effects affect the high number of drug overdose deaths in the U.S.?
Fentanyl is a big problem. So the opioid addiction in America, and not just in America, but other advanced economies, but America has the worst sort of outbreak of this. And as I said before, it's very much related to lower living standards, low salaries, and the depopulation of country areas. You see, a lot of this problem with opioids is not only in big cities where you might think it's going to happen in big cities, but it's actually happening in poorer rural areas as well, or semi-rural areas, where there's a big lack of cultural and other kind of health services, educational services, those sorts of things. And this mostly affects people with lower education standards, and that's quite a few people these days in America, because it's so expensive to go to university. And the worst affected group are those that have not finished high school. And in America, that's surprising, but that number is very, very big. But yes, the side effects of this, of course, are, there's violence, all the drug crime, rising prison populations, all sorts of problems like that. And yes, mostly this, of course, is the same group of people. This is lower income groups with lower education levels.
Now, with the surge of opioid addiction and drug overdose, the Biden administration is trying to curb the crisis by reforming and liberalizing federal rules for treating opioid addiction. This would include relaxing the prescription of drugs such as methadone, which is unavailable to Americans who do not have access to special federally approved opioid treatment clinics. Regular physicians are not allowed to prescribe the medication, even though they can prescribe opioids. What would be the future of the drug epidemic in the U.S., and what should be done to stop it?
If the United States, on the positive side, stop the geopolitical kind of warfare orientation and instead moved for economic development and started rebuilding railroads, collaborating in the Americas for water projects with Canada and Mexico, where you had a whole prospect for the population of good jobs and a future for families, you could push down the dependency on drugs. And in addition, we need a cultural shift to go with this. That is, there has been a very bad counterculture from Hollywood and from London and elsewhere for decades for depraved music, the drug culture, that it's clever to take drugs, and for bread and circuses, like in the days of the decline of Rome, where everyone is completely oblivious by being involved in sports, which on their own is a fine thing, physical activity. But people's lives have been so destroyed by the lack of productive employment and a future and hope. If this is done, things could be turned around.
It would not come as a surprise if Big Pharma would also be behind the push to relax rules and regulations for treating opioid addictions. Some might argue that treating a drug addiction with another drug would defeat the purpose. Methadone itself is an opioid that might cause physical dependence and addiction. So whether it is patients taking opioid to relieve the pain or feed their addiction, or if they intend to cure their addiction, they would still be filling the coffers of Big Pharma. That is what is called a win-win situation for pharmaceutical companies.
Big Pharma is a very big problem because it's a kind of a strange cycle, isn't it? I mean, these drug companies promote to doctors the prescription of their drugs. This has been famously documented everywhere. Doctors going on holidays to Las Vegas and so forth, paid by drug companies. And so there's sort of kickbacks, if you like, for doctors that prescribe more of those drugs. And so they're very freely promoted and prescribed. And the government keeps widening that window to allow more drugs of these kinds, opioids and antidepressants and so forth, to be prescribed. And then they're prescribed mostly to the people that, I'm not going to say that people don't need them, but I'm going to say that to groups who, as we've talked about before, lower income, lower education, they don't really understand medical and health situations, and the doctors are obviously promoting these drugs to them. And the health companies, of course, make a lot of money out of this. And we know that during COVID, for example, and the mRNA type COVID vaccines, it was the US government that funded the research and development of these drugs, but it's the pharmaceutical companies that are keeping the profits. They're not paying back the government and taxpayers that money. And so this is also the problem related to, antibiotics in farms and in animals, also with opioids and antidepressants. It's a kind of a vicious circle. The pharmaceutical companies make a lot of money. The doctors then promote the use of these drugs, and then the people that use them have more health problems and need to go back to their doctors. And look, this is a vicious cycle, and big pharma needs to be controlled more. But I think in America that's going to be very difficult. The rise of big pharma is a real problem, an economic and social problem.
Antidepressants and other forms of drugs are used frequently in the United States. Health experts are concerned over the use of these drugs that is now being revealed that not only has very little or no benefit to the user, it harms others and the environment by causing drug resistance and the creation of superbugs. Pharmaceutical companies, however, are only concerned about their profits. So with the doctors and politicians all benefiting from the sale of drugs, there is little hope in controlling the so-called big pharma.